The glass revolving doors of the lobby reflected my crisp white blazer as I walked through them. The security guard at the front desk barely glanced up from his monitor. Julian had always complained about the incompetence of the ground floor staff. I didn't stop at the visitor's log. I walked straight toward the private executive elevator. The guard finally noticed me and reached for his radio. I didn't give him the chance to speak. Check the updated ownership logs. The building belongs to Vance Holding. He stared at his screen, his jaw going entirely slack as the new data loaded. I stepped into the velvet-lined elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. I watched the digital numbers climb, feeling the silence settle deeply in my chest. Arthur was waiting for me in the executive lounge, holding a velvet box in his gloved hands. He looked exactly the same as he had the day my father died, perfectly pressed, entirely immovable. He opened the box to reveal a solid brass nameplate. "Your grandfather's desk has been moved in, as requested." I picked up the heavy brass. Elena Vance, CEO. I hadn't used that name in half a decade. I walked into the main boardroom and set the nameplate down. The city skyline stretched out behind me, pale and gray in the morning light. I placed the acquisition file carefully on my left. Then, I pulled Julian's signed divorce papers from my briefcase and placed them on my right. The trap was perfectly set. From the hallway, I could hear the distinct sound of Julian's leather shoes hitting the hardwood. He was speaking loudly to his assistant, his tone dripping with that familiar, unchecked arrogance I had endured for 5 years. "Tell the new owner I don't have all day. We need to finalize this transition." I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, my grandfather's chair. I folded my hands over the acquisition file. My heart didn't race. My palms weren't sweating. The woman who had cried in the snow 36 hours ago was entirely gone. The brass door handle turned. The heavy glass door pushed open. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like physical weight. And I watched his eyes move from the skyline to the files. And finally, he stepped back from the desk as if the wood had burned him. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone, his thumb pressing the screen with violent, uncoordinated jabs. He was dialing his lead counsel, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to make Julian's problems disappear. "Julian, get Richard on the line, right now. Someone is playing a very expensive game." I picked up my grandfather's solid silver pen, feeling its familiar heavy weight between my fingers. I remembered how Julian used to mock my cheap family heirlooms when we lived together, assuming I came from nothing because I never demanded anything from his accounts. "Elena, Richard's firm was retained by Vance Holding an hour ago. He cannot legally advise you." The phone slipped a fraction of an inch in his grip, his knuckles turning stark white. The silence in the boardroom suddenly felt suffocating, pressing against the glass walls and the expensive leather chairs. He was entirely alone, and for the first time in 5 years, he knew it. From the glass walls of the mezzanine lounge, I watched him pace across the ground floor lobby. He was shouting at someone through his phone, his arm cutting through the air in sharp, desperate arcs, while the employees he usually ignored openly stared at him. I held my phone to my ear, listening to Arthur's steady breathing on the other end of the line. "He is attempting to contact the minority shareholders. He wants an emergency injunction." I watched Julian point an angry finger at the security guard who had let me up. 2 weeks ago, he had stood in that exact spot and told a financial magazine that he built his empire entirely on his own, while I held his coat just out of frame. Let him make his calls. Panic makes him sloppy. He stopped pacing and looked directly up at the mezzanine glass. Even from 80 feet away, I could see the distinct shift in his posture, from sheer panic to a sudden, dangerous calculation. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to tear the building down to find a loophole. Memories surfaced with the sharp, painful clarity of broken glass. We were standing in his kitchen, the marble countertops gleaming under the expensive pendant lights. He was adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, preparing for the charity gala where he would eventually introduce me to his mistress under the guise of networking. Julian. Don't touch the investment files on the desk, Elena. You wouldn't understand the restructuring anyway. I had been holding a cup of black coffee, watching him categorize me as a decorative, uneducated liability. I hadn't told him that the restructuring he was so proud of was entirely underwritten by a shell company I had established on my 25th birthday. Elena, I'll leave them exactly where they are. I had spent years shrinking myself to fit perfectly into his narrow life, pretending my silence was ignorance to keep the peace. The coffee had gone entirely cold in my hands, as I realized he didn't just want a wife. He wanted a subordinate audience. The heavy click of the boardroom door brought me sharply back to the present. Arthur stepped into the room, his leather briefcase held firmly in his left hand, and walked straight to my desk. He did not spare a single glance at the empty chair where Julian had been sweating an hour prior. He found the bypass clause in the original founding charter. He is invoking a board vote. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the crawling city traffic below. Julian was trying to use a technicality that required a 2/3 majority to halt any hostile takeover if the current CEO filed a formal grievance. He thinks he can buy their loyalty before the market closes. The glass felt freezing against my fingertips. Julian was heavily cornered, which made him incredibly dangerous. He knew the board members' personal secrets, their hidden debts, and their vulnerabilities, and he was going to use every piece of leverage he possessed to keep me locked out of my own building. Arthur's private office always smelled faintly of lemon wax and aged parchment. We had spread Julian's corporate bylaws across the long mahogany table, the afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows over his sweeping, arrogant signatures. Section 4, paragraph 9. If he secures 3 of the 5 board members tonight, the acquisition is frozen for 90 days. 90 days was more than enough time for him to offshore the assets, drain the primary accounts, and leave me holding a hollow shell of a company. I traced the edge of the paper, realizing he had built a formidable fortress, but he had built it entirely with my grandfather's hidden capital. Who was he meeting with to secure the votes? Arthur slid a single glossy photograph across the polished table. It was Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer and Julian's oldest friend. If Julian secured Marcus, the rest of the board would follow out of sheer momentum, and we were suddenly fighting a very different kind of war. The lighting in the private dining room of Le Bernardin was intentionally dim, designed specifically to hide the faces of powerful men making expensive mistakes. I sat 3 tables away, perfectly obscured by a large floral arrangement and the low, steady hum of wealthy conversation. She's unstable, Marcus. If we don't lock down the shares tonight, she'll liquidate our entire life's work. I watched Marcus swirl the vintage Bordeaux in his glass, his expression entirely unreadable in the candlelight. Julian was leaning aggressively across the table, playing on their shared history and selling a fabricated narrative of a bitter, vindictive ex-wife. Tell him about the Cayman accounts, Julian. I dare you. He continued to lie through his teeth, completely unaware that Marcus had been the one who anonymously sent me the photographs of Julian and his mistress 3 months ago. The foundation of Julian's counterattack was built on a loyalty that had already rotted away. The damp evening air clung heavily to my wool coat as I waited silently by my idling town car. The valet brought Julian's black Mercedes around to the front, the bright headlights cutting sharply through the light city fog. He walked out of the restaurant alone, adjusting his lapels with a look of absolute, arrogant triumph on his face. Julian, you played a good game, Elena, but you're out of your league. The board votes tomorrow at noon. I didn't argue with him. I didn't step forward or attempt to defend my position. I just looked at the man I had dedicated 5 years of my life to and felt absolutely nothing but cold clarity. Elena, I'll see you at noon, Julian. I slid into the warm leather seat of the town car and watched him drive away into the fog. He thought he had secured the votes to lock me out of my grandfather's legacy, completely unaware that the trap I had set for him hadn't even snapped shut yet. The rain began to fall exactly as the town car pulled away from the restaurant curb, blurring the red taillights of Julian's Mercedes ahead of us. My phone vibrated against the leather seat before we even reached the highway on-ramp. I recognized Marcus's private number on the display immediately. He was not a man who wasted time on pleasantries. He offered me 30% of the offshore holding company. I watched the city lights warp against the wet glass, feeling a strange, hollow sense of validation. Julian was mortgaging his entire future just to maintain the illusion of control over a company I already owned. I told Marcus to accept the offer in writing, setting the first hook in a very long line. The heavy oak doors of the Vance estate required 2 hands to open, and the silence inside the grand library was absolute, completely untouched by the city noise. Julian believed I grew up in a modest suburban home, entirely unaware that this sprawling stone fortress existed just 40 miles outside the city limits. Arthur was standing by the unlit fireplace, holding a silver key that unlocked the primary family vault. Revealing my full hand tomorrow meant exposing the Vance dynasty to the public and making myself a permanent target for every financial vulture in the state. Once we submit the global asset declaration, your anonymity is permanently forfeited, Miss Vance. I walked over to the velvet-draped table and looked at the century-old ledger resting on top. 5 years of hiding my true identity to build a normal marriage, and it had ended with my suitcase thrown into the snow. I reached out and took the silver key from his hand without a single tremor. The air inside the subterranean vault was perfectly temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of metallic dust and old currency. I stood before the polished steel safety deposit boxes, looking at the immense fortune my grandfather had built entirely from nothing. Julian had spent years lecturing me on the mechanics of compound interest while eating dinners I secretly paid for. I unlocked box number 7 and pulled out the original founding documents of his startup. Let him see the fire. The papers proved that Vance Holding was the sole angel investor when he started the firm in our tiny apartment. He hadn't built an empire. He had merely been managing my money. I placed the documents in my leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut, the sharp sound echoing off the concrete walls. The morning sun cut harsh angles across the granite floor of the startup lobby as I walked through the revolving doors. Julian was standing near the security desk, completely ignoring the morning rush, leaning intimately over a blonde woman I recognized as his newly promoted director of marketing. He was tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb, completely secure in his perceived victory. Go pick out a new car, Sarah. The board is handling the trash today. The cruelty of the statement hit me, but it didn't pierce the armor I had spent the night rebuilding. I stopped precisely 3 feet behind them, letting the sharp click of my heels echo against the granite. I watched his shoulders stiffen immediately at the sound, the arrogance bleeding out of his posture in an instant. The brushed steel doors slid shut, sealing Julian and me inside the confined space of the executive elevator. He was standing as far away from me as physically possible, staring at the digital floor indicator with a rigid, unnatural intensity. The scent of Sarah's heavy floral perfume was still clinging to his tailored lapel, a silent testament to the absolute lack of respect he had for our 5 years together. "I hope you brought a box for your things." Marcus secured the final votes at breakfast. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes perfectly level, watching my own reflection in the polished metal doors. He was stepping blindly into an execution, entirely convinced he was the one pulling the lever. I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase. The 5 board members were already seated at the long mahogany table, their postures stiff and their laptops completely closed. Julian walked past me and immediately took the head chair, steepling his fingers with a practiced, authoritative grace. I remained standing at the opposite end of the room, placing my leather briefcase quietly on the polished wood. Board Member Davis, we have a motion to invoke the Founder's Protection Clause and block the Vance Holding acquisition. I looked at Davis. He owed over $2 million to a private equity firm for his failed real estate ventures. I looked at the other 3 men, each of them carrying hidden, catastrophic debts that Julian had promised to cover if they voted my way. They were all sweaty. The heavy grandfather clock in the corner struck noon, the brass chimes ringing sharply across the silent room. Julian leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus with an expression of absolute, hungry anticipation. He was waiting for his oldest friend to deliver the final, killing blow to my grandfather's legacy. Julian, all in favor of the motion to block, raise your hands. The room remained completely motionless. Davis looked down at the table. The other 3 executives actively avoided Julian's gaze, staring at the walls or their own folded hands. Marcus sat perfectly still at the center of the table, entirely refusing to move a single muscle. Julian's confident smile fractured, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he stared at the 4 unraised hands. He stood up slowly, the heavy leather chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He looked at Marcus as if the man had just driven a literal knife into his ribs. Julian Fjorkis. We had a deal. What are you doing? I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out 4 thick red envelopes, sliding them precisely down the center of the table. I didn't need to explain that Vance Holding had quietly purchased the debt portfolios of every single man sitting in that room at 8 o'clock this morning. They didn't work for Julian anymore. Their entire financial lives belonged exclusively to me. I returned to the house at 8 in the morning to collect the last of my winter coats. The foyer still smelled of the expensive cedarwood candles I used to order from Paris, but the warmth of the home was completely gone. Julian was standing by the spiral staircase, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, acting as though my presence was a minor, pathetic inconvenience. I remembered how he used to ask my opinion on every single suit he wore, long before his ego outgrew the man wearing them. Julian, leave the keys on the counter, and don't scratch the marble on your way out. I placed the heavy brass keyring onto the granite surface without making a sound, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an argument. The metal felt cold against my skin, a physical reminder of the 10 years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into his narrow life. He actually believed he was stripping me of my comfort, completely unaware that I had paid the down payment for this exact house through a blind shell corporation. Elena, enjoy the house, Julian. Make sure you keep the insurance updated. He laughed, a short, ugly sound that echoed in the empty hall. I walked out the front door, knowing exactly when the bank would be calling him to reassess the mortgage he could no longer afford. The mahogany walls of Arthur's office absorbed the sounds of the frantic city below, creating a vacuum of perfect silence. I sat in the leather wingback chair, examining the financial reports Arthur had neatly aligned on the polished desk. Julian's company was hemorrhaging capital faster than my analysts had predicted, mostly due to his reckless spending on corporate retreats and vanity projects. I traced the downward red line on the graph, thinking about how many nights I had stayed up helping him balance his early ledgers. Arthur, concerned. He's trying to secure an emergency bridge loan from Vanguard Trust. If he gets it, he might survive the week. I leaned back and looked at the oil portrait of my grandfather hanging above the fireplace. Vanguard Trust was the crown jewel of the Vance family portfolio, an institution I currently chaired under a strict, impenetrable non-disclosure agreement. Julian was literally crawling to my own bank to save himself from the trap I was meticulously building around him. Elena, Saul Vanguard's risk assessment director. Tell them Julian's credit line is permanently frozen. Arthur nodded, picking up his encrypted phone and already dialing the private number. I watched the second-hand tick on the vintage grandfather clock, feeling the terrifying, satisfying weight of absolute control. The Bistro Laura was notoriously impossible to book, a place where the lighting was always dim and the champagne cost more than most cars. I sat in a secluded corner booth, stirring my sparkling water, waiting for Julian's biggest independent shareholder to arrive. Across the dining room, sitting at a prime center table, was Julian with his new junior vice president, Vanessa. He was feeding her a piece of lobster, looking incredibly pleased with his new, upgraded life. Vanessa: I just can't believe she signed it without fighting for alimony. She must be terrified of you. Her voice carried over the ambient jazz music, sharp and grating against the refined atmosphere of the room. I didn't turn my head, but I felt the familiar sting of betrayal flare up in my chest like a hot coal. I had spent years defending him to my family, turning down board seats to play the supportive wife, and this was how he summarized my dignity? Julian, arrogant. She knows she's nothing without my last name. She's probably looking for a cheap apartment in the suburbs right now. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the freezing glass center my racing pulse. I wasn't just going to take his company anymore. I was going to systematically dismantle the entire foundation of his pride. The corridor leading to the restrooms was lined with antique mirrors and imported silk wallpaper that absorbed the restaurant's noise. I was fixing my lipstick when Vanessa walked in, her confident stride breaking the moment she recognized me in the reflection. She was wearing the diamond tennis bracelet Julian had bought her using the company's emergency expense account. Oh, Elena, Julian didn't mention you could afford a place like this on your own. I capped my lipstick and placed it deliberately into my leather clutch, never breaking eye contact with her reflection. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of pity. She thought she had stolen a prize, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had just boarded a sinking ship. I don't pay for the meals here, Vanessa. I own the building. She scoffed loudly, clearly thinking it was a desperate, pathetic lie, and pushed past me to the marble sinks. I walked back out into the dining room, leaving her alone with her delusions. Marcus Hale slid into the leather booth opposite me, smelling of expensive cigars and nervous sweat. He held 30% of Julian's voting shares, making him the only man who could stop my hostile takeover before Monday morning. I slid a plain manila folder across the table, watching his eyes dart anxiously toward Julian's table across the room. If Julian sees me sitting with you, he'll strip my board seat by tomorrow morning. I tapped the folder once with my index finger, demanding his absolute attention. I knew Marcus was dangerously over-leveraged on a bad real estate deal in Dubai, a secret my private investigators had unearthed in less than 3 hours. I wasn't here to beg for his shares. I was here to provide his only escape route from bankruptcy. Elena, authoritative. Open the folder, Marcus. You won't care about a board seat when you see the purchase price. He opened it, and I watched the rigid tension instantly drain from his shoulders as he read the 8-figure sum. He reached for his gold pen without saying another word. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of Vance Tower, the 70-story headquarters of my family's financial empire. I stood on the sidewalk, pulling my trench coat tighter against the biting autumn wind. Arthur was waiting by the private underground entrance, holding a secure tablet with the final transfer documents ready for my signature. Julian's lawyers are filing an injunction to block the Vanguard freeze. They're getting desperate. I looked up at the massive silver letters of my family name bolted onto the marble above the revolving doors. I had hidden my connection to this monolith from Julian because he was deeply insecure about successful women, a flaw that was now destroying him. That same insecurity was blinding him to the very obvious net closing around his entire life. Elena, let them file it. By the time a judge looks at it, I'll already own the controlling shares. I pressed my thumb to the tablet screen, permanently authorizing the final wire transfer of $45 million. The transaction completed in 3 seconds, shifting the balance of power forever. I walked into the cavernous atrium of Julian's firm, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished terrazzo floor. The security guard at the front desk immediately stepped into my path, a heavy hand resting instinctively on his radio. He had been explicitly instructed by Julian not to let me pass the turnstiles under any circumstances. Ma'am, Mr. Hayes left strict orders. You are not allowed on the premises. I looked at the man, recognizing him as the guard whose daughter's medical bills I had quietly paid off 2 years ago when Julian refused to grant him a bonus. I didn't want to make his job difficult, but I needed to personally deliver the acquisition notice to the legal department. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick, embossed envelope. I'm not here to see Mr. Hayes. I'm here to leave this with legal. Call Arthur Bancroft if you need clearance. The guard hesitated, glancing at the gold wax seal on the envelope before slowly, respectfully stepping aside. I walked past the security gates, feeling the heavy, undeniable shift in power as I entered his territory. The cold air hit my face as I exited the building, the envelope safely deposited on the legal director's desk. My phone buzzed aggressively in my pocket, the screen displaying a frantic, unsaved number that I immediately recognized as Julian's private line. He had just received the automated notification from the SEC regarding the massive shift in corporate ownership. Julian, screaming over the phone. What did you do? Who the hell is Vanguard representing? I stood by my car, watching the panic unfold in real time through the sheer terror in his voice. He was suffocating, trapped in a financial cage of his own making, and he still had no idea who was holding the key. I ended the call without saying a single word, leaving him to the silence. I walked into his executive suite without an appointment, Arthur trailing half a step behind me with the finalized proxy documents. The receptionist didn't try to stop me because Arthur had already informed security that we represented the majority shareholders. Julian was pacing frantically behind his desk, screaming at his lead counsel on speakerphone. He looked exhausted, the sharp arrogance from the restaurant completely replaced by pure, desperate panic. I remembered how he used to look like this in our tiny first apartment when the electric bill was due, before he convinced himself he was invincible. Julian, furious, panicked. You have no right to be here. Leave immediately. I didn't take a single step backward. I placed my leather bag on his pristine desk, watching his eyes dart toward Arthur with sudden confusion. The tension in the room thickened as Arthur silently handed me the legal notice of our shareholder majority. Julian stared at the Vanguard Trust logo embossed on the folder, his brain clearly struggling to connect my presence with the financial guillotine hanging over his neck. For a brief second, I felt a heavy wave of sadness for the man I thought I had married 10 years ago. That man was gone, entirely consumed by the pathetic shell of ego standing in front of me. Ms. Vance represents the Vanguard Acquisition Committee, Julian. Julian let out a harsh, disbelieving breath, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He still thought I was just a messenger, a bitter ex-wife who had somehow begged her way into a low-level corporate job to spite him. Steel doors closed, cutting off Julian's string of hollow threats as the elevator descended toward the lobby. I leaned against the cold metal wall, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, despite the calm mask I wore. Destroying him felt entirely different than I had imagined during those freezing hours in my broken car. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about surgically removing a cancer from the financial ecosystem my family had built. He will liquidate his personal assets to fight this. I watched the floor numbers drop in rapid succession, knowing his personal assets were built entirely on margin loans. He was going to drain every last cent trying to protect a throne that was already dismantled. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my new residence offered an unobstructed, glittering view of the city skyline he claimed to conquer. I stood with a glass of red wine, the only light coming from the glowing screens of my market terminal, tracking his company's collapsing stock. A part of me wondered if I was taking this too far, if exposing my family's legacy was worth humiliating a man who was already destroying himself. I looked down at the pale ring of untanned skin on my left hand where my diamond used to sit. The hesitation vanished completely, replaced by cold, absolute clarity. Elena, take it all. Leave nothing. I set the wine glass down and drafted the email that would officially freeze his offshore contingency accounts. The boutique smelled of expensive leather and white lilies, a stark contrast to the ugly confrontation unfolding at the primary register. I stood near the private fitting rooms, examining a silk scarf, while Vanessa argued loudly with the store manager over a declined platinum card. She was aggressively tapping her manicured finger against the glass counter, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. I recognized the card as Julian's secondary corporate account, the exact account my auditors had frozen at 9 o'clock this morning. Vanessa, run it again! My fiancé owns this city. The manager apologized politely but refused to return the card, citing the bank's strict confiscation protocol. I watched Vanessa storm out into the street, realizing Julian hadn't even warned her that the ship was going down. I sat in the back of my town car, parked directly across the street from the massive pillars of Citibank's main branch. Julian marched up the stone steps with a thick leather briefcase, desperately seeking a bailout from his last remaining financial ally. I knew the bank's president intimately. He had served on my grandfather's board for 2 decades before I took over. I pulled my phone from my purse and sent a single encrypted text message to the executive suite. Ensure Citibank receives his updated debt ratio. I watched Julian disappear through the revolving doors, knowing he was walking into a complete ambush. 20 minutes later, he walked back out, his shoulders entirely slumped, moving like a man who had just seen his own ghost. The long mahogany table was covered in acquisition documents, illuminated by the harsh, clinical light of the overhead fixtures. I sat at the head of the table, reviewing the final terms of the hostile takeover that would completely strip Julian of his CEO title by Friday. My grandfather used to sit in this exact chair, teaching me that mercy in business was merely an invitation for future betrayal. I traced the golden embossed letters of the Vance logo, finally accepting the enormous weight of the name I had hidden for a decade. Julian's lawyers just requested an emergency mediation session. I closed the thick binder, a dark, satisfying sense of anticipation settling deep into my bones. He was completely out of moves, completely out of money, and finally ready to beg. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway toward the private elevators, the legal binder tucked firmly under my arm. Tomorrow, Julian would walk into the mediation room expecting to negotiate with a faceless corporate entity, entirely unaware that he was walking into his own execution. I stopped in front of the massive glass windows, watching the rain begin to fall over the city streets below. 10 years of silence had built to this exact moment. Elena, schedule the mediation for tomorrow morning. Our territory. Arthur nodded respectfully, typing the confirmation into his tablet without a hint of hesitation. I stepped into the elevator, finally ready to show my ex-husband exactly who had been paying his bills all along. I sat on the cold, hardwood floor, surrounded by 10 years of carefully curated photograph albums. The city glowed outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, but the massive apartment felt like an absolute tomb. I traced my index finger over a faded picture of Julian from our first anniversary, his smile genuine, his eyes entirely focused on me without a hint of distraction. That was before the aggressive corporate promotions, before the massive startup capital I secretly funneled into his accounts through blind trusts, before the unyielding greed completely hollowed him out. I closed my eyes, letting the crushing weight of the memory pull me directly back to the exact night I made the biggest, most devastating mistake of my entire life. Where did you go, Julian? The freezing rain soaked right through my thin cotton sweater as I collapsed completely onto the hard concrete bench. My grandfather had just been given less than 3 months to live, leaving the entire, terrifying weight of the Vanguard financial empire directly on my 22-year-old shoulders. Julian found me hiding in the dark, dropping to his knees in the thick mud in his cheap, scuffed work boots, just to hold my violently shaking hands. He didn't know I was a billionaire heiress preparing to inherit half the city. He just thought I was a scared, broken girl losing her only remaining family. I held onto his shoulders like a desperate life raft, absolutely terrified that if he knew the undeniable truth, the money would corrupt him, like it corrupted everyone else in my world. I've got you, El. We don't need anything else. Just us. The steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in the sterile, aggressively white hospital room. My grandfather squeezed my hand, his physical grip shockingly weak for a man who had ruthlessly built a global financial dynasty from absolute nothing. I told him quietly about Julian, about his pure kindness in the freezing courtyard, and my incredibly desperate plan to permanently hide my vast inheritance to preserve our normal, quiet, unburdened life. He looked at me from the hospital bed with a profound, suffocating sadness that I did not fully understand until the night Julian threw my suitcase into the snow a decade later. Money doesn't change a man, Elena. It only unmasks him. I snapped the heavy leather photograph album shut, a loud crack echoing violently through the empty, cavernous living room. The man in my fading memory, the one who knelt in the hospital mud to protect me, had completely and permanently ceased to exist. I had spent an entire decade deliberately shrinking my presence, pretending to be small, compliant, and helpless, just to protect a pathetic illusion of love that he eventually threw into the winter street like garbage. The hot, stinging tears I had completely refused to shed on the devastating night of the divorce finally broke loose, burning my cheeks as they fell onto my silk robe. I wasn't crying for the pathetic loss of my toxic marriage. I was violently mourning the 10 irreplaceable years I had willingly stolen from my own potential.
Elena, no more hiding. Not from him, not from anyone.
The heavily armored black town car idled quietly as my personal driver opened the thick, reinforced rear door. I stepped out onto the pristine concrete of the private garage, feeling the immense psychological weight of the tailored white power suit I had meticulously chosen for the morning's corporate execution. Arthur was already waiting patiently by the secure VIP elevator bank, holding a sleek leather folder that contained the absolute, unarguable dismantling of Julian's entire professional existence. He studied my face for a long, calculating second, actively looking for any lingering trace of the broken, weeping wife he had witnessed 3 nights ago in his office. He found absolutely nothing but cold, refined, impenetrable steel.
Arthur, the mediation room is fully prepped. Are you entirely certain about this path, Elena?
The massive bank of surveillance monitors glowed with a harsh, pale blue light in the dimly lit, heavily fortified security hub. I stood perfectly still with my arms tightly crossed, watching the silent live feed of the main lobby as Julian walked nervously through the revolving glass doors. He looked completely unraveled, his usually immaculate, tailored suit visibly wrinkled, clutching a cheap cardboard coffee cup like it was his only remaining shield. Vanessa was walking 2 steps behind him, looking incredibly nervous at the massive marble pillars and the highly trained armed guards stationed firmly at every single exit. They looked exactly like desperate mice wandering blindly into an exceptionally expensive, inescapable trap.
Vanessa,
Why do we have to meet the proxy here? This entire place is intimidating. The incredibly plush, custom-woven carpet absorbed the sharp sound of my heels as I walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors of the mediation suite. My chest suddenly tightened with a harsh, suffocating spike of panic, a pathetic phantom echo of the timid girl who used to reflexively apologize whenever Julian raised his voice at the dinner table. I immediately stopped walking, pressing my bare palm flat against the cold, frosted glass of the corridor window to firmly anchor my racing mind back into reality. This was the exact, agonizing dark moment my grandfather had warned me about on his deathbed, the painful, necessary bridge between the woman I was pretending to be and the monster I needed to become to survive. I took one long, impossibly deep breath and let the timid, agreeable wife die completely and forever. I am Elena Vance, and I own this entire room. The narrow anteroom smelled strongly of fresh espresso and the sharp, undeniable metallic tang of pure, concentrated corporate hostility. Arthur carefully adjusted his silver cufflinks, his face morphing into an impenetrable, terrifying mask of seasoned legal professionalism as he approached the heavy double doors leading to the main conference table. I stood perfectly still in my immaculate white suit, listening intently to the muffled, highly agitated sounds of Julian aggressively arguing with his visibly panicked defense lawyer on the other side of the solid wood. The financial trap was perfectly set, the legal lock was turned, and the arrogant audience was completely, hopelessly captive. Arthur, hand firmly on the doorknob. They are seated.
shall we proceed with the acquisition, Madam CEO?
Arthur pushed open the heavy oak doors, allowing me to step into the massive, sunlit mediation suite a full step ahead of him. Julian was sitting at the far end of the incredibly long mahogany table, flanked by his visibly nervous defense attorney and Vanessa, who was aggressively tapping her manicured nails against her phone screen. He looked up, his exhausted eyes immediately locking onto my tailored white power suit, his face instantly twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He still possessed the blinding arrogance to believe that I had somehow manipulated Arthur into bringing me here just to beg for a pathetic share of his dissolving assets. The sheer magnitude of his absolute ignorance was almost breathtaking to witness in person, completely validating every single ruthless move I had made over the last 72 hours.
Julian, slamming table, furious. "What the hell is she doing here, Arthur? This is a private corporate negotiation." I didn't flinch at the violent crack of his hand hitting the polished wood, simply walking past his pathetic outburst with perfectly measured, deliberate steps. I vividly remembered how a single raised voice from him used to make me frantically apologize for things I hadn't even done, a toxic reflex I had entirely burned out of my system. I reached the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the absolute power in the room, and placed my heavy leather binder down with a loud thud. I looked directly into Vanessa's eyes, watching the arrogant smirk slowly melt off her face as she actively registered the incredibly expensive cut of my clothes and the undeniable authority in my posture. The absolute silence in the room was suffocating as Arthur calmly distributed the thick, black acquisition folders to Julian's trembling legal team. I remained standing at the head of the table, letting the crushing, terrifying weight of my physical presence dominate the space before a single word was officially spoken. Julian aggressively flipped open the first page, his panicked eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon, desperately looking for a corporate loophole that simply did not exist. I watched his gaze hit the final signature line, the exact moment his brain finally connected the massive Vanguard Trust proxy to the familiar name written in bold ink beneath it. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified, hollowed-out ghost of the cruel man who threw me into the snow. Julian, choking, breathless. "Elena Vance, Vanguard? You are the proxy?" I slowly unbuttoned the jacket of my white suit and took my seat in the massive leather chair, looking down at him like a pathetic specimen trapped under a microscope. 10 years of suffocating silence, of hiding my family's immense legacy just to protect his incredibly fragile ego, completely vanished in the span of 4 terrifying seconds. I felt an overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered justice wash heavily through my chest, entirely erasing the broken girl who had cried on the hospital bench a decade ago. He was completely trapped, permanently stripped of his false power, and completely at my mercy in a room specifically designed for his slaughter. Elena, cold, absolute. I am not the proxy, Julian. I own the trust. The revelation hit the table like a physical bomb, instantly sucking all the remaining oxygen out of the enormous corporate room. Julian's lead attorney aggressively shoved his chair backward, immediately realizing that his arrogant client had blindly dragged them into an unwinnable fight against the most powerful financial dynasty in the entire city. Vanessa stared at me with wide, completely terrified eyes, the absolute horror of her terrible life choices finally manifesting in real time. She suddenly looked at Julian not with admiration, but with sheer, unfiltered disgust, realizing she had hitched her wagon to a man who had just bankrupted himself to spite a billionaire. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany, genuinely enjoying the exquisite agony radiating from his trembling hands. "Vanessa, you told me she was nobody. You said she was broke." Julian couldn't even look at her, his eyes entirely fixed on the gold Vance logo embossed on my leather binder, as if it were a loaded weapon pointing at his chest. The massive empire he thought he had built from scratch, the brilliant investments he endlessly bragged about at our dinner parties, had all been quietly and constantly funded by my silent capital.
I watched the profound, devastating realization crush the very last pillar of his toxic pride, reducing him to absolute rubble right in front of my eyes.
He finally understood that he had never been the brilliant king of his own castle. He had only been a deeply arrogant tenant living rent-free in mine. Elena, sign the absolute surrender of your shares, Julian, or I will ensure you spend the next decade drowning in litigation. His hands shook violently as he reached for the incredibly expensive gold pen sitting uselessly in the center of the leather blotter. He looked up at me one final time, his reddened eyes silently begging for a microscopic shred of the blind mercy I used to give him entirely for free. I stared back at him with absolute, impenetrable frost, thinking about the divorce papers he had forced me to sign while I was sobbing uncontrollably on our kitchen island. The universe possessed an incredibly dark sense of humor, bringing us exactly back to a table with a pen and a contract that would permanently end a life. He pressed the gold nib to the paper, his signature completely erratic and broken, legally signing away the entire company he had sacrificed our marriage to build. Julian, I had absolutely no idea who you were.
I stood up smoothly, picking up the perfectly executed contract and handing it to Arthur without breaking my intense, devastating eye contact with my ruined ex-husband. He was absolutely right. He never actually knew me, because he had spent an entire decade completely obsessed with his own reflection. The suffocating, heavy weight I had carried for 10 long years completely evaporated, leaving me feeling terrifyingly powerful and incredibly light. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, leaving him sitting paralyzed in the burning ruins of his own unparalleled greed.
Elena,
No, Julian. You had no idea who you were.
the towering marble columns of the main lobby were bathed in brilliant, blinding morning sunlight as I stood quietly on the second-floor observation balcony. Directly below me, 4 heavily armed Vance Tower security guards were publicly escorting Julian and Vanessa toward the massive revolving glass doors. The entire morning shift of corporate executives, the very people Julian used to desperately try to impress at networking events, stopped completely to watch his deeply humiliating exit. Vanessa was crying uncontrollably, aggressively pulling away from Julian's grasp, screaming loudly that she was entirely done with his lies. I gripped the polished brass railing, feeling the cool metal ground me as I watched the final, pathetic chapter of my false marriage officially close forever. Arthur, the market has fully absorbed the acquisition. Your shares are up 4%.
I didn't look at the financial tablet Arthur offered, my eyes entirely fixed on the exact moment Julian was physically pushed out onto the cold, unforgiving city sidewalk. He turned back, looking wildly up at the towering glass facade of the building, desperately searching for me. But the heavily tinted security glass completely hid my presence. He was nothing but a tiny, insignificant speck on the street, entirely banished from the kingdom he foolishly thought he had conquered.
I finally took a deep, unrestricted breath, ready to completely rebuild my authentic life without the heavy, toxic anchor of a weak man dragging me down. The massive corner office smelled exactly like my grandfather's old study, a rich blend of lemon oil on mahogany and the quiet stillness of untouchable authority. I sat behind the expansive desk, running my hand over the cool leather blotter, finally feeling like I fit perfectly into the exact space I was born to occupy. Arthur placed a neatly organized stack of manila folders directly in my line of sight, tapping the top file with a profound sense of finality. It was the deed to the suburban mansion Julian and I had shared, formally transferred back into my primary holding company.
I didn't feel a single ounce of nostalgia looking at the printed address. I only felt the clean, sharp edge of a surgical extraction successfully completed. Arthur, the locks on the property have been changed. The remaining furniture is going to charity. I opened the silver pen on my desk and signed the bottom line without a trace of hesitation. The house was just another asset now, entirely stripped of the ghosts that used to haunt its hallways. Elena. Good. Put the property on the open market by noon. The harsh, flickering fluorescent light of a cheap roadside motel illuminated the staggering depth of Julian's ruin in the glossy photographs. I examined the highly confidential images my private investigator had placed gently on my mahogany desk, analyzing them with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Julian was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress, holding his head in his hands while his phone sat entirely silent. Vanessa was nowhere in the frame, having abandoned him the exact second his corporate credit cards violently declined at the hotel front desk. He had viciously traded 10 years of unshakable loyalty for a remarkably cheap illusion, and now he was bankrupt in every conceivable way. Arthur. She left him at the curb, Elena. He has nothing left to leverage. I slid the photographs directly into the heavy metal shredder beside my desk, listening to the satisfying mechanical grind chew through the glossy paper. I didn't need to look at his misery to validate my success ever again. Elena. Cancel the investigator. He is no longer worth our capital. The heavy rain drummed loudly against the reinforced glass of my town car as we idled at a red light in the financial district. I looked out the tinted passenger window and saw Julian standing exposed on the wet sidewalk, shivering violently in a cheap, unlined jacket. He was staring blankly through the heavily barred window of a grim pawn shop, clutching the ruined silver watch I had bought him for our 5th anniversary. He looked completely broken, hollowed out by the agonizing realization that his massive ego had permanently cost him the only person who ever truly loved him. I watched a city bus drive past and splash dirty water directly onto his shoes, but he didn't even flinch. Driver. The light is green, Ms. Vance. Should I pull around? I didn't roll down the window. I didn't offer a single shred of pity. I simply kept my eyes focused on the road ahead. Elena. Drive. Don't stop until we reach the gallery. The gallery was brilliant, overflowing with the kind of vibrant, chaotic art that Julian had always furiously claimed was a massive waste of capital. I stood directly in front of a massive canvas painted in deep blues and golds, holding a crystal flute of extremely expensive champagne. For an entire decade, I had ruthlessly curated my existence to ensure I never outshined him, purposefully making myself small so he could feel exceptionally tall. Now, standing in the middle of a room filled with the city's most powerful elite, nobody was looking past me to find the man in charge. A tall, impeccably dressed gallery director approached me with a polite, deferential smile, holding a small silver reserved sign. Director, polite, admiring. It is an incredibly powerful piece, Ms. Vance. Shall I mark it as sold? I took a slow sip of the champagne, feeling the sharp, crisp bubbles burst against my tongue. It wasn't just about buying a painting. It was about permanently reclaiming the loud, colorful life I had entirely suppressed for a ghost. Elena, smiling, relaxed. Yes. Hang it directly in my primary boardroom. The city sprawled out infinitely beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive ocean of glittering lights that finally belonged entirely to me. I stood by the glass with a quiet, profound sense of peace, unbound from the toxic gravity of a man who only wanted a shadow, never a partner. He thought throwing my suitcase into the freezing snow would permanently destroy me, entirely unaware that the cold was exactly what I needed to wake up. You can spend your entire life quietly building a throne for someone else, but the second they decide they don't need you, they will never hesitate to lock you out of the castle. But the beauty of hitting rock bottom is discovering that the concrete foundation underneath actually belonged to you the entire time.
Drop a like if this one hit different. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next one.